Hello, and welcome to our weekly Parsha Shir with the commentary of the Alshich dedications. Let's start with dedications, as we normally do, for the Refuah Shlema of Chaim Morchadov ben Esther, for Rafal Chai ben Sora, for Oriach Chaim ben Chana Yehudis. They should all have a Refuah Shlema. Also this week, I'd like to dedicate the Shir to celebrate the Simcha on Sunday, the forthcoming Simcha of a family called Trapp from Los Angeles, and their daughter is getting engaged. She is engaged. She's getting married on Sunday in Lakewood. And so, for the Trapp family, for the Kala, for the Chosin, we want to wish you all hearty mazel tov, and you should have a life full of bracha. This week's Parsha is moving on, of course, from last week's Parsha, which is Truma. And even though it's moving on from Parsha's Truma, the theme is the same theme, which is the Mishkan. So we're in Parsha's, obviously we're in Parsha's Tetzave. And Parsha's Tetzave is famous because it's the only Parsha in the Torah in which Moshe Rabbeinu's name is not mentioned after his birth. You can find a reference to that in previous Shirim. But basically, when he said to HaShem, if you're going to destroy the Jewish people, then miss me out from your Torah. And when a tzaddik says something, HaShem always reacts. And so he missed him out from the Torah. But in one Parsha, this Parsha, the Parsha which is also his birthday and the day when he passed away. Now, there is a hint here. When Moshe, as it were, challenges HaShem, it sounds almost a little bit like a chutzpah, sort of, because he's protecting the Jewish people. But there's a hint when a tzaddik, you can sometimes find that tzaddik, it's hinted that he is a tzaddik, endorsed he's a tzaddik, but the fact that the day he was born is the same day that he passes away. So as the bit that Moshe Rabbeinu is missed out of after his challenge to Hashem, if you're going to wipe out the Jewish people, miss me out from your sefer, which sounds, as I said, a little bit of a chutzpah. But notice it's also his parsha, which was his birthday and his death day, but they're the same day. And the hint there is that he was a tzaddik. What he did was right. But to continue from what we were doing last time, we're talking about the Mishkan, the function of the Mishkan, the function of the Beis HaMikdash. And we said, or the Alshich said, you can't possibly conceive that there could be a physical place that could contain the non-physical. A finite cannot contain an infinite. What does it mean that Hashem, the Shekhinah, the presence of Hashem, was in the holiest of holy places, the Beis HaMikdash? That, said the Alshich, offends against basic Jewish, anathema to Judaism, basic Jewish ideas and theology. God doesn't, as it were, move to places which are physically constraining. It doesn't make sense. So we said that really because this is the place where there's a contact between heaven and earth. When heaven and earth kiss, say Chazal. In other words, down here is a reflection, the Beis HaMikdash Shomata, the Beis HaMikdash in the Holy Temple on earth, is a complete reflection of the Holy Temple in heaven. So in that sense, being there, that confluence of or connection of two places, that's where, as it were, the Shekhinah and Hashem is. Not these in this world, but it's a mirror image of what's going on above. That's where we concluded last week, although we did say that this is also possible to find Kedusha in a human being as well, that will make Hashem's presence be felt there. And remember that even though Nevi'us ended with the construction of the second Beis HaMikdash, but the concept of prophecy ended, Nevi'us, with the construction of the Beis HaMikdash. However, the connection between man and God, and indeed not only that, but Ruach HaKodesh, a man or a woman being inspired by Hashem, so that they become effectively the mouthpiece of Hashem, that didn't end, that continues. So even though it's impossible for us to conceive beyond the limits of our imagination, all you need to do is find people who have somehow managed to get to the top of the mountain and hang on to their coattails, and you can get there too. That's what we were talking about last week. But there's a problem. If we're now saying that, Kabbalistically speaking, the junction between the crossroads, if you like, between heaven and earth is the Beis HaMikdash, and in that place, the presence of God can be seen, can be perceived, can be felt, what about the Mishkan? If that's the Beis HaMikdash, the permanent place, in the exact location where heaven and earth meet, and where God created the world from, What about the Mishkan? How can we have a Mishkan? The whole concept of the parshas that we're talking about, and later on, when the Torah talks more about the Mishkan, how could there be a Mishkan? It's in the desert of Sinai. The desert of Sinai, this barren, inhospitable place. That's not the beautiful verdant mountains and hills of Jerusalem. So how could God's presence be felt there? More than that, we said the analogy is if you imagine a scuba diver. They were the precursors of scuba divers before, of course, you have compressed air in a tank in the back of the diver. It gives them about an hour maximum, unless you do two tanks, of diving time. But they usually have a big brass helmet. You've probably seen that, a dry suit, big metal boots to get them to the bottom, and then the air being pumped through a tube. That is what the Beis Hamikdash is. It's a direct line from heaven. And so the hashpah, the energy that flows from this world, that created the world in the first place and sustains it, comes directly from heaven in a straight line. Now imagine, continue my metaphor here, imagine the diver is moving further away and further away from the point where the ship is above. Then the line, if it gets entangled or it gets constricted, then that energy, that air, that oxygen is not flowing with the same vibrancy and force that it was when it's in a direct line. That's how it works throughout the rest of the world, the Kabbalistic sources say, and the Alshich talks about. But the place for direct contact, where the air is going to be freshest, is going to be directly under the Beis Hamikdash, which takes us back to our question. And the Mishkan, how could it be that God's presence could be in the Mishkan? It's not even in the land of Israel. The most direct is straight in the place of the Temple Mount. At least in the land of Israel, it's only a little diversion, a little angle. You're not going very far. The land of Israel, after all, is very small. But what if you go further away? And what if you go round the curvature of the earth? Japan and places like this, Australia. Nothing against the Japanese and the Australians, incidentally. Please forgive me if you're watching this in either country. But you've now twisted the line. How does that work? So that's what the Alshich is talking about in this week's parsha. What's the concept of the Mishkan? So let me read a little bit of you to you from the Alshich. And he says the following thing. But for God's presence to be manifest in a place which is not directly under heaven, not directly in Jerusalem, how does that work? How could that possibly? Chalila v'chalila. God forbid, God forbid. For God, as it were, his presence to be felt in those places outside the land of Israel. If Kabbalistically, that's the focus, that's the direct junction between the two worlds, or conjunction between the two worlds, then how does it work outside of those worlds? So he says something which is really very deeply and interesting stuff, but it's definitely Kabbalistic. Now, I'm going to read to you what the Alshich says here, because this is very unique. Looking at the Alshich, I can't remember a time when he said these words, and so I'm going to read this to you. The truth of the matter is to understand this concept. To understand and explain this concept to you properly, I would have to depart completely from my normal approach, which is an analysis of the posuk in the posuk, without moving from what the posuk actually says. I'm not twisting the words. I'm not looking for poetic imagery, but just a raw and scientific dissection of what the word is saying. That's my usual approach. To explain to you the concept of how a Mishkan, the tabernacle, could work, that God's presence could exist outside the parameters of the land of Israel, or outside the parameters of the direct contact on the mountain, which is called Har Moriah, where the temple stood. That takes me into territory I'm not happy to go to. Interesting. Im hu ledrosh derech eshara sheyachad sadik darko nechad v'sach b'liboy v'sichlo asher yamahu b'kitzim nimratz hu ki lamala yesh mikdash echad. Now, so he says. So let me just give you just a sketch of the concept. We've got two phrases in the Torah. One is a Mishkan, temporary dwelling, and one is a Beis Hamikdash, which is the permanent dwelling. One is located at the maximum point of contact, and one is when the Jewish people travel from place to place to place. That's the Mishkan. What does that mean? So he says, and this is an astonishing thing, he says that truly there is a concept of, I'm trying to think of this, a good metaphor for this. There is, sometimes you're plugged into the grid, into the power grid, and so you get maximum electricity. But of course, sometimes when you are outside the grid, then what you have to do is take a mobile generator. That, says the Alshich HaKadosh, is the Mishkan. The Mishkan is a mobile generator, waiting as a prototype for when, as it were, it's going to be plugged into the grid. The Mishkan does act like this. But how does that work? We're still with the problem of how does that work? So then he takes us into the Kabbalistic areas, which he's reluctant to take us into. And he says the following thing: Behu, in emes shehuchen Mishkan l'kol hakovod aniska ali David Salom. What happened was that the actual architect, not the architect, the wrong word, the builder, the constructor of the Mishkan was somebody, of course, called Betzalel. Now, this is complete Kabbalistic stuff. Hashem was in the world at the beginning with Adam and Chava. After Adam and Chava changed the whole structure of the world by their mistake, then Hashem retreats, or his presence can no longer connect. So far, he moves to the seventh level of heaven, a seventh dimension. There's no geographic space, of course, we're talking about. The Torah has, as the Rambam explains, has to speak in language that we understand. So it's easy for us to understand something moving further away and further away. But certainly we can understand that Hashem's presence was not as acute, not felt, in fact, quite the opposite, after the sin of Adam and Chava. He, as it were, retreats to the seventh level. But 6 tzaddikim brought Hashem back 6 levels. So let me read this bit to you, because this is interesting. So Hashem retreats to the 7th level. But through 6 tzaddikim, then God is brought down to the penultimate level, which is back on earth, which is where, as it were, he started. And who were these 6 tzaddikim who, as it were able to draw Hashem back to the place where he originally intended to be? Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Levi, Kahos, Levi's son, Amram, Moshe's father. These are the greatest, we're now talking the greatest tzaddikim in the history of the world, to that time anyway. And all of that, the construction of the Mishkan, is going to be a vehicle now. He's creating a generator to bring the Shekhinah of Hashem down to a place where outside the grid. The grid is in Eretz Yisrael. The places close to the generation of the electricity, of the energy, is of course the Temple Mount, as we said. And Betzalel is able to construct the Mishkan, as it were, to be the perfect generator to, as it were, allow Hashem Shekhinah to be on earth. Al kihutzrach Moshe adanino l'sham kihu hakim kol efsei haaretz k'Moshe Amar u'ma ha'yisa hakama zu al haaretz ach achshav shakona hakama mal haaretz. That was Moshe Rabbeinu. Hu at Tzadik Hashvi. Moshe Rabbeinu was able to bring the Shekhinah down to earth in the Shekhinah. He's the 7th Tzadik who brings Hashem through the 7 levels of connection to the world directly to be here. But that's an important point. It was ultimately Moshe Rabbeinu being there himself that allowed this thing to happen. And this is a concept the Alshich mentions a little bit before as well. And that is, what about the Ovos, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, whom we mentioned before? The Jewish sources are full, Torah sources are full of the fact that they became the Merkava of the Shekhinah, the connection point in which the Shekhinah was able to dwell on the earth. After all, Remember, it says, "Make for me a mikdash, and I'll dwell b'salchom in them." The temple. Here's a surprise: the temple and its precursor, the Mishkan, are Plan B. Plan A was Hashem was supposed to inhabit us. We would not need a Mishkan. There was no Mishkan for Adam Arishan. Adam Arishan was in such a spiritual level that he was godly. And as I said many times in the sharing before, as the Gemara says, the angels couldn't distinguish between Adam Arishan and God. Ultimately, the presence of God was able to apply itself, connect itself to somebody, and Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, who are self-generating tzaddikim, so that the holiness of Hashem can connect. It's got a base on earth. A human being can reach such a level, but Hashem says to the first human being that you've done a great job. But in order to really take off, you've got to move to the land of Israel. And now we understand why. My connection with you here is tenuous. When you get to the land of Israel, it'll be far, far more intense. And so Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov in the land of Israel are able to sustain that connection. It seems to be that you can have a sustaining of the connection between Hashem, his presence, his Shekhinah on earth, at least temporarily, outside the land of Israel, even in horrible places, through the agency of somebody who, as it were, is a godly person. And that's something, again, we said last week in the share. You find the same idea, incidentally, when, again, in the Alshich, in Parsha Shlach Lecha, when Hashem gives advice to Moshe, who says, should I send spies or should I not send spies? And basically, Hashem says, I'm not telling you. It's entirely up to you. I'm not going to tell you what to do. But Shlach Lecha, says the Alshich, means send for you, for your benefit. It's the same as Hashem said to Abram, Lech Lecha, go for you. It's going to be good for you. This is going to be good for you if you send the right set of people who's going to bring back a good report. Of course, sadly, they brought back a bad report. Why is it good for you? Because if, as Hashem sees the possibility of them bringing back a bad report and the entire generation falling in the desert, then again, he can't come to earth. But if your soul is there, if I'm down on earth to collect you, I can pick them up as well. Again, the same sort of concept, but through the medium of a tzaddik, a Moshe Rabbeinu, then that last jump from the second level, from 6, 5, 4, 3, 2 to 1, can be achieved through a connection with a great person. That's all Kabbalistic. Listen to what Rosh Volba has to say about this in Ali Shar. Ali Shar is wonderful, wonderful work. It truly is a wonderful work and incredibly deep. He points out, don't we say, Mola Horetz Kavoida, Kol Horetz Kavoida? Isn't the presence of God everywhere? What is this concept that it's only on the Mount Sinai? On Mount Harabayas, Har HaMoriah. When was they called Hevdel ben Yerushalayim? Then New York. And if that's the case, he says, there's no distinction between Yerushalayim and New York. If this verse is right, biblical verse is right, and everything, Hashem's presence is everywhere, what's the distinction? Why do you have to be there? Very simply explains, because you feel it there. Remember, the Torah speaks in the language of many Adam, of human beings. The Torah addresses the human condition. The human condition is simply to feel the majesty of God, the connection to God in certain places and not in other places. If you're a great tzaddik, you could feel God everywhere. There's a book, one of my wife's favorite books is called The Holy Woman. It's about a woman who was a famous tzaddik lived in Eretz Yisrael. I think her name was Kramer, but I've forgotten that. And she lived in this little moshav somewhere. She was in Auschwitz. She said to Mrs. Rebbitzin Rigler, who's written several books, who at the time, she writes about this herself, it's not, I suppose, such a secret that she wants to keep, but she was living in an ashram in India. And she came to visit this holy woman in Israel as part of her own spirit. Obviously, she's a spiritual seeker. Somebody told her to find this holy woman. And when she explained to her what she was doing, she was living in this ashram, she said, Auschwitz was not such a terrible place, which had her eyeballs popping out her head. Auschwitz is not a terrible place. We could pray to God in Auschwitz. We could do mitzvahs in Auschwitz. But the place that you're in, that's a terrible place. You can't do mitzvahs there. You're not soaking in the spiritual sustenance that mitzvahs allows you to have where you are. But in Auschwitz, even in Auschwitz, you could. I knew somebody called Mr. Falk, Ramatziel Solomon's father-in-law, who was in Dachau. And he said, my attitude was, I don't know why God has put me in this place as opposed to anywhere else, but it's my job to get on with being a Jew here, the same as it would be anywhere else. In this essay, which is called Makam of Bizman Shel Adam, the place and time of a person, that, he goes on to say, there are places. Each and every one of us, when we're brought to this planet, every single aspect of our landing has been calculated by God. That is the place that you were born into, because the place, he says at the beginning, I'll read this a little bit to you. Everything is a place and everything is a time. But the place that we're born into, that defines who and what we'll become. The culture which we've become part of, we're raised in, even if we're Jewish and very serious about being Jewish, are resistant to the general attraction of non-Jewish philosophies, it will affect you to some degree. That's a definite, that's a given. It'll affect you linguistically if you speak in the language of the country you live in. That obviously reflects the culture that produces the language too. It's an inevitability. Having said that, however, that's not something which is necessarily negative. In fact, it can be something which is extremely positive. The message which Yaakov Avinu sent to his brother Esau told him, I was been living for the last decades or so with my father-in-law Lovan. He says, I'm Lovan Garti Tari Mitzvah Shemati. I've been living with Lovan, but I kept all Tariag mitzvahs. Don't think that I became corrupted by living with a cheat and a fraud, which of course his father-in-law was. But more than that, as Rabbi Yerucham says in Das Chacham Musar, it's not that I was able to keep mitzvahs despite living with a crook and a fraud. I was able to keep mitzvahs because I lived with a crook and a fraud. You can only test yourself if you're tested. If you're in an environment where you're tested. If you're never tested, you'll never know if you'll pass. It was that ability to be in that place, which might, as it were, be a negative place, and overcome it. And indeed, the time that you live in as well. That's what Rav Shlomo Wolbe says here. The time that you live in and the place that you live in is going to define your very, very being. More than that, the time that you're brought into has its own unique challenges. When some people turn around and say, oh, if only I lived in a different time, when the rabbis were greater or the spiritual level of the community was greater, that's an idiotic thing to say, says the Medrash Rabbah. And he says, what is wisdom? But the time that you've been sent into the world is perfectly tailored for who and what you are. The tests of your generation are going to be tests which are unique to your generation and different to other generations. Your job is to embrace those challenges and defeat them. Your time and the place that you live, that's going to be critical. That means to say that indeed, as Rav Shlomo Wolbe says, you can find God in New York, you can find Kedusha in anywhere in the world. You feel it more acutely. You're inspired more acutely in Yerushalayim, obviously, and consequently can achieve more. But at the highest levels, it really would make no difference where you are or when you're in the world. Something the Chofetz Chaim says in his commentary in the Torah, Moshe Rabbeinu, his first confrontation is the wrong word, his first experience of a meeting with the Shekhinah, the presence of God, is the burning bush. And God says, take your shoes off from your feet. And what does that mean? Take your shoes from your feet. What does that mean? So he says that people have got that habit of saying, if only I was elsewhere, I was in a better place, I could achieve more, I could be more. Not so. The place you're standing now was the message that Hashem was giving Moshe Rabbeinu. That's Admas Kodesh. That's holy place. And the time you're standing there, you've got a challenge. I'm about to give you a challenge. You're going to have to go and save the Jewish people. Play your historic, unique role in saving the Jewish people. But we all have a historic and unique role. Not maybe on the same scale, but the same basic idea. We've got that role as well. It's an idea which I found many years ago in a wonderful sefer called the Aznaim Latara. Someone called Reb Zalman Sorotskin. And Reb Zalman Sorotskin is in the parsha of Vayakil, where it says, Vayakil Moshe is called Adas Israel. Moshe gathers the entire Jewish people. Vayomanim says to them, these are the things that I command you to do. So it's talking about the Mishkan, back to the Mishkan. Don't break Shabbos. You're not allowed to work in Shabbos. Why? You might think, as Rashi says, that the building of the Mishkan in of itself is enough for you to be able to break Shabbos. This is a more important project. Rav Zalman Sorotskin says, let me read this. He says, so therefore, if it was really talking about the building of the Mishkan, why did it tell us stop before it starts and say, don't break Shabbos? He says, I think it means that this. Shabbos Mishkan both Shabbos and the Beis HaMikdash have the exact same function and the exact same ambition. To elevate the Jewish people and to connect them to Hashem Yisborach, the Father in heaven. Through Kedusha. Shabbos, he Kedusha Bazman, but Shabbos is Kedusha in time. Whereas the Beis HaMikdash, or the Mishkan, is a Kedusha in place. So logically, what would you think would be the best? So Shabbos once a week, you can get that spiritual boost. But the Mishkan, and eventually the Beis HaMikdash, you can get that whenever you go. It's open 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. So you can get that not just once a week, but also, which would be more holy? Holiness in time or holiness in place? You might argue place, back to what he says. However, on Shachim Olam Malba Oiskin, but soft Torah's mitzvahs Megdoshim Esash Nefshen B'Kedushas Zman. Lumazayis Mishkan, you can go in Shabbos, elevate yourself, but the Mishkan, it can be something which lasts forever. However, he says, the truth obviously is that we would not have a Mishkan where you could feel more easily Hashem's presence, or a Beis HaMikdash. They only lasted centuries, a few centuries. But Shabbos, Kedusha in Zman, has lasted all the centuries. It's where you are now. If you think about it, of course, it may be beyond our imaginations, but if you imagine, yes, you can feel, it's possible to feel attachment to the divine even when you're in Chutz La'oretz, even in New York to go to Shlomo Volba, as long as you're connected to a tzaddik. Moshe himself, the presence of God, only came to the Mishkan through the fact there was a tzaddik there. It's essential to make sure in your life, whether you're a man or a woman, you have somebody, you have a connection to somebody like that holy woman, like Mr. Falk, like great tzaddikim of the generation. Because then you get a feel, as we said last week, of what holiness is, and that holiness can be something that moves beyond the geographic location and boundaries of Jerusalem, even Eretz Yisrael, to the whole world being full of the covenant of Hashem. But that requires there to be a Moshe Rabbeinu figure in order to allow that focus to be focused on him or her, and for you to be able to feel that. Wish you a wonderful Shabbos. Hope to see you again next week.